Thank you very much, Adam, both for the introduction and for the invitation. This is my first time in Prague, and so it's really a blessing and a privilege to be in this beautiful city and to be able to speak to you in this absolutely marvelous, beautiful building and chamber. I'm going to speak today, as Adam indicated, in some ways more broadly and philosophically than perhaps a number of the other speakers about the origins of the crisis of democracy. And I want to begin by noting that in some ways the good news for those of us who are supporters of democracy is that for all of the hue and cry and the division, the various parties that we have been divided into, amid the deep disagreements over Western politics and society today, there seems to be at least widespread agreement on at least one point. Democracy is not being well served. The divergent and acrimonious divide that has today opened across the West is in part a battle in the name of democracy, and indeed uses or at least claims the very legitimacy that is conferred by the name democracy itself. In some senses, all parties, no matter what one's party seem to be today, seem to at least in principle and maybe indeed in fact want to claim to be on the side of democracy. And we should note that this is a rather unique thing, that throughout the course of history, democracy itself has often been at least one of the parties that has been rejected. So it's, I suppose, worth noting at least that. Those, for example, who stand against the rise of populist nationalism, I think perhaps a topic of concern today, those who stand against the rise of populist nationalism in the West regularly invoke the specter or name of democracy as itself being under attack, the undermining of democratic norms, the attack upon democracy by authoritarians. Arguments of this type are common in my own country of the United States, but I witness them almost every day in the various reporting that I'm following throughout Europe, and especially my current teaching post. I'm currently teaching this semester in London, England. It's actually a relief to be away from the terrible, divisive politics of the United States and to be in a country where there's stolidity and tradition and a kind of calmness. I say that there's a protest outside my door every day. Most recently, for example, in this past Sunday's Times newspaper of London, there was a column by Lord Michael Heseltine, who was a former Conservative deputy, who denounced efforts, and I quote, to impose an undemocratic scorched earth Brexit upon the people. He points, for instance, to the government's proroguing of Parliament as a prime example of such an undemocratic scorched earth policy. Now, on the other hand, defenders of Brexit, of course, frequently refer to the outcome of the referendum as proof of their solidarity with the people, and defend actions such as the prorogation of Parliament as an effort to advance the will of the people. Both sides are claiming the legitimacy of their position based upon following the will of the people. They, for example, denounce efforts to prevent a snap election that might end up showing widespread support for Johnson's government. And indeed, Heseltine, in that article in which he denounces undemocratic nature of the opposition, he writes, quote, a general election is, of course, no way to settle a titanic issue such as Brexit. So we don't want to be undemocratic, but we also don't want to put this question to a new election. Everyone, it seems, finds the other side to be insufficiently democratic. It perhaps is not entirely clarifying that many scholars repeat that charge today. And based on my own unscientific study of the literature on the rise of contemporary populism, a great many of those scholars hold the views that the rise of populism constitutes an existential threat against democracy. Much of the contemporary and growing literature on populism commonly repeats this view, equating the rise of populism with an attack upon democracy. In fact, in this case, this stance at the very least pits many mainstream scholars against the outcome of elections and suggests that there is often a substantive, if implicit, shared assumption about what the meaning of democracy is, that democracy may in fact not comport with the will of the people. In effect, democracy is used, whether in keeping with electoral results or against electoral results, as a defense of the core views of the people. Now, I'm not going to settle this particular question and debate today, but what I do want to submit today is that the various claims to the word democracy that take place today is not, in fact, a reflection of the fact that we live in the most democratic of ages, but rather reflects a fact that democracy has in many ways been effectively neutered in the modern world, and that it is in fact a part of and a consequence of a long-standing and, I would submit, highly successful project dating back to the earliest stages of the Enlightenment. Shrouding many contemporary appeals to democracy is a deeper and long-standing hostility to democracy, one that is so deeply internalized that the seemingly incoherent invocations of democracy against the demos are now almost second nature. Now, pre-Enlightenment political philosophy, areas that I teach in, was frank in its mistrust toward democracy. Reach back to college political philosophy 101. Plato and Aristotle, for example, were frank in their mistrust and even hostility toward democracy, counting it as among the worst types of political rule. And this assessment continued under their influence and the influence of many thinkers through late antiquity and the Middle Ages. Forms of monarchy and aristocracy, walking around the city, it's evident that these forms once were in some prominence, were not only dominant the actual political practice, but widely held to be philosophically superior to rule by the people. Such rule by the people, was judged to be irrational, debased, and driven by resentment by the dispossessed toward their moral superiors. Now, in contrast to these forthright critiques of democracy, Enlightenment Enlightenment hostility toward those long traditional preferences of rule by aristocrats, monarchs, nobility, and so forth, was often framed by a philosophical appeal to the legitimating will of the people. This view was especially witnessed in the development of so-called social contract theory, first in the monarchist theories of Thomas Hobbes, and later in the more liberal theories of limited government associated with John Locke. You can tell I'm teaching in England this semester. Both the monarchist Locke and the somewhat less monarchist Hobbes and the somewhat less monarchist Locke both agreed that for a political regime to be considered legitimate, a truly democratic moment was needed, a unanimous or near unanimous moment of consent to the political order in the form of a social contract or what was called a compact or a covenant. Now, while this moment was admittedly in the philosophy of these thinkers a fictive moment, a theoretical moment of universal consensus, it was regarded as the necessary conceptual basis of government itself. And yet for Locke and the early modern constitutionalists, this conceptual consent was in essence the legitimizing mechanism for a radically privatistic and individualistic purpose or end of government. Government, its state, and politics itself was conceived as a kind of mutual non-aggression pact of otherwise hostile and mistrustful individuals whose only reason for reaching this one moment of consensus was that they wouldn't kill each other. We will agree for a moment not to kill each other, to reach a moment of mutual self-protection in order to protect our individual rights. The best summary of Locke's argument, we Americans are really good at summing sophisticated ideas or making shortcuts, was penned by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," he wrote, "that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Notice, governments are instituted to secure the rights that we hold as inalienable parts of our nature. The purpose of the public realm, of the political realm, of government itself, is to secure the private interests of each individual its legitimacy deriving from that very brief moment of universal consent in which we agree that the public exists to serve the private. The founding fathers of America, Jefferson among them, were deeply influenced by Locke and these philosophers, not only in their invocation of Locke in the lead up to the revolution and separation from Great Britain, but in their conceiving of the new government, the first liberal, truly liberal, singularly liberal government in the history of the world. Among the most important documents of that period were the Federalist Papers arguing for adoption of the Constitution, and Federalist 10, number 10 in particular, laid out a new philosophy for the purposes of government itself. In that paper, written by the father of the Constitution, James Madison, one of our presidents, as well as the architect of the American Constitution, he argued in that paper that the first object of government, quote, the first object of government is the protection of the diversity in the faculties of men, which is to say, the protection of the natural abilities that each of us have, but which are spread diversely and unequally to each of us. The various abilities and talents and capabilities that we all possess, but which will manifest themselves in ways that lead us to live lives that are not only different, but will lead to different accomplishments and attainments. And he wrote that in particular, because of the fact of this diversity of faculties, there occurs differences in material prosperity, the attainment of property. The public then, Madison argues, has as its first object the protection of the diversity in the faculties of men from which, and I quote again, the rights of property themselves originate. Because of this, the diversity manifests itself in our different possessions. Thus, again, an emphasis that the existence of the public sphere exists to protect our differences and inequalities as rights-bearing individuals. Now, even though these thinkers advanced a notion of an original democratic moment of consent, this apparent commendation of democracy was understood as limiting any further democratic claims, as a limitation on democratic claims. They understood that the rule of the many, among other things, in fact, constituted a threat against those fundamental rights, especially property rights. The many would always be jealous of the few who benefited from their diversity of faculties. And thus, the moment of democratic unanimity entailed a self-limitation upon democracy itself. And Madison, somewhat later in Federalist 10, emphasized the dangers of democratic energies that needed to be mediated and moderated through the election of what he called fit characters, who would become the representatives of the people. Arguing that these representatives here in the Senate, where it's perhaps appropriate to think about them, these representatives would know the public good better than if the entire people were assembled for that purpose, because they would have greater insight into the nature of the political order itself, less driven by passions and interests. I'm sure there are never passions and interests expressed in this room. Such a regime could be called a democracy, but one that was aimed at constraining democratic energies, especially by limiting actual democratic self-government, but perhaps more fundamentally by reorienting public concerns to the protection of private interests. Now, the inevitable inequalities that arose from this order, what I want to call the first wave of liberalism, the inevitable inequalities that arose from this first wave of liberalism led to a rejection and a reaction by a second wave of liberalism, sometimes called progressives, who attacked the rights-based theories of property that were central to liberalism's first wave, this Lockean, Madisonian manifestation. We could call it the Anglo-American tradition of liberalism. Developed by later thinkers primarily on the continent, such as Rousseau and Kant and Hegel, and still later by Karl Marx, a figure known to some of you here in this country, progressives challenged the inegalitarian outcome of the regnant philosophy and practice of classical liberalism, instead arguing that a more collective understanding of property would lead to the greater and more universal enjoyment of liberal freedom. Early versions of what are today theories of human capabilities, or the belief that that to realize all human potential would require greater egalitarian distribution of material resources, led to a more beneficent view of the state and its interference in the marketplace. And yet these thinkers to a person also noted that merely making property more widespread would do little to dislodge what had been a traditional alignment between property rights and traditional cultural views that seemed to accompany a society that defended property rights, what Marx would call the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois culture that prized social and familial and religious traditionalism. Even as progressives attacked the privatistic individualism bound up especially in older conceptions of property rights, they advanced arguments on behalf of the liberation of the individual in the social sphere, and especially emancipation from custom and tradition, the limitations imposed by customary or cultural practices and norms. That is, such thinkers at once condemned certain forms of individualism, even as they advanced a different idea of individuality. If you want some evidence of this, I would recommend a very short book by John Dewey, the American thinker, called Individualism, Old and New, in which he argues for the replacement of property-based individualism for a theory of individualism in which we are freed from the social sphere through the greater sharing of property rights and material goods. A good representative exemplar of this position is John Stuart Mill, another Englishman. You can see again, my London time is influencing my thinking, whose great book, important book, On Liberty, is framed as an effort to achieve a liberalism that has been achieved politically, but not yet socially, seeking to liberate individuals from what he called the despotism of custom. He called on government no longer to be merely laissez-faire, and libertarians are wrong to think Mill is just a libertarian, but that would actively protect the expression of individuality from the stultifying conformity of social pressure. The purpose and aim of government was not merely, or couldn't be merely, the protection of any material differences that might arise from protection of property rights, and in fact, Mill eventually aligned himself with communism, but rather to expand the sphere for the expression of individuality. Protecting the sphere, in turn, Mill believed, would spur great innovation and change and transformation, what Mill called experiments in living. The problem, from Mill's perspective, was that the greater part of any human society, the majority, the people, seemed always to be somewhat favorable or rely upon the abiding norms of custom, what he called despotism. They did not look admiringly upon those who flouted the norms of custom for the sake of leading lives of experiments in living. And in Mill's view, social disapproval was in many cases a far more powerful form of oppression than any laws that could originate from the state. Custom was, in his view, despotic because its influence was widespread, reflective, unreflective, and pervasive. Right? You can identify and fight against an oppressive law, seek to persuade the senators. But how do you fight against the oppression of opinion, of the views of an amorphous mass of people? When Mill read Tocqueville's Democracy in America, he jumped out of his skin and embraced the phrase that the great thing to fear was the tyranny of the majority in modern times. The tyranny especially of traditionalist opinion that would squelch the more innovative, revolutionary, and experimental kinds of lives that would be lived especially by a minority of citizens. For this reason, Mill argued that any democracy must be moderated by an overrepresentation of those with more progressive views. In his book, Considerations of Representative Government, Mill argued on behalf of a plural voting system. Maybe we're discussing plural voting today, but he had a different idea perhaps, that would give preference, more votes, to those who had greater attainments in education. The more years of schooling, the more votes you would get. So I assume we could more or less control this country in this room. His best approximation then for achieving this aim was to associate more voting or more influence in society with higher educational attainment, those whom he believed would feel most liberated from the power of custom. Now, while few progressives took up Mill's recommendation in the letter, many, and indeed perhaps arguably most, joined him in spirit. The basic conundrum he identified remained: how to ensure that the more enlightened part of society would direct the direction of society in a more democratic age. Now, in the American context, there was a somewhat different effort that was undertaken. In the 19th and early 20th century, what we witnessed was the rise of what was simultaneously a growing effort of democratization, more direct voting rights, rights of referendum, rights of initiative, initiating legislation, rights of recalling elected officials after an election, all seeking greater popular control over the government. But at the same time, notably, the progressive movement was also responsible for the creation of the modern bureaucracy. Indeed, thought that the modern bureaucracy was essential to good government, and in particular called upon the growth of a nonpartisan, non-political group of experts who would become permanent members of any government and would manage, devise policies separate from the pressure of politics and from elected officials. And in my country today, you see a kind of tug of war going on between an elected representative, Donald Trump, and the head of the Federal Reserve, a member of the bureaucracy, right, who says, I am nonpartisan, I am non-political, I won't be influenced by politics. As many political scientists have long observed and predicted and been concerned about, a growing divide was, is, and it seems to me has grown between the populace and the bureaucracy, a divide that is reflected in different concerns of whether or not simply electoral demands that can change variably, or a kind of continuation of policy that expertise deems necessary ought to govern in a democratic age. Now, I could say much more perhaps about this tension between a perceived divide between the people and bureaucracy, but since many of you live in the European Union, I won't say any more. That was supposed to be a joke. Okay. For much of the post-war history of the West, the political world has been divided between these two iterations of liberalism. Robert Kagan once called them the divide between Venus and Mars, or I should say Mars and Venus, the Anglo-American and the continental tradition. It has been the divide between classical liberalism and progressive liberalism, the divide between the right and the left. And yet, what I want to stress here is that both of these iterations of liberalism stress that the purpose or end of government in their distinctive ways is the liberation of the individual in order that they might be able to pursue their own interests, ideals, and idea of the good. On the one side, more in the material, economic realm. On the other side, more in the social, public realm. Both conceptions of liberalism stress the need to protect the individual expression inherent in the diversity of our faculties from the oppressiveness of the community. Both liberalisms envision the eventual emergence of a certain kind of inegalitarianism, whether in the form of the greater accumulation of material wealth in the Lockean, Madisonian, Anglo-American conception, or the liberation of the more progressive, the more experimental part of society that requires in some way, shape, or form greater political representation, particularly due to fear of oppression from a more backward-looking tyranny of the majority. We have grown accustomed to regarding the difference between these two liberalisms as capturing the most basic divide, the most basic division of modern politics. And notwithstanding genuine agreements, what I want to suggest today is what we have actually witnessed is a stunning and undeniable convergence of the achievement of these two aims, what we might regard as separate aims, divergent, competitive aims. In the West, what we see on the one hand simultaneously is that economic individualism and inequality that was anticipated and lauded by classical liberals has become regnant. Study after study shows that a globalized market has been ruthlessly efficient at differentiating the diversity of the faculties of mankind. Right? Finding the place where my particular talents can be best employed has become one of the ways that we have transformed the world, globalization. Right? My students, I sometimes joke with my students. I teach in the middle of Indiana, in cornfields. I joke with them, you'll all end up in one of 5 cities in the world, because they're very elite students. And I had a student once raise his hand and say, what are the other 2? Right. There are only 3 cities that I would possibly want to live in, and they're global. They're all global cities. Right. Around the world, people have internalized this individualistic economic logic, perhaps not by preference. Right. Most of my colleagues are Marxists, but they sure do act like capitalists when it comes to their income, when it comes to their salary. Right. We have internalized this economic logic and even its framing as inevitable, as following certain laws of nature. There's no stopping globalization because it comports ultimately with human nature. This vision of economic liberalism, we could say tracing back to Locke, to Madison and others, seems to be globally regnant. But at the same time, we have seen the rise of a more perfected individualism of a people that have been liberated from all of custom and tradition, now increasingly embracing a self-conception as completely unattached from the most basic ties of human relationality. A people increasingly without siblings, without children, without a spouse, and even if one follows recent studies, without close friends. Every measurement of relationality, right? I'm a social scientist by training, and it's not worth a bucket of spit generally, but when it comes to studies of relationality, it seems to me that social science is really good. And every measurement of relationality across the West shows a precipitous and simultaneous decline. The decline of associational life, studied among other things by Robert Putnam at Harvard University, right? Bowling alone. The decline of family life, decline of marriage, decline of having children, decline of having siblings. The decline of membership in such traditional institutions as a church, the decline of religion, the rise of the nuns. I'm a Catholic, and I got excited when I heard about this. There are more nuns, but it turns out it's spelled N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. The decline of religious association, the increase of measurements of loneliness. A quarter of Americans now declare that they are always lonely. They always have their cell phone, but they're always lonely. And the rise, the remarkable rise, right, in a time when we're seeing a decline of the mortality rate, the rise of mortality from self-inflicted forms of death by despair, opioid addiction, and suicide. It appears that the same people, in many ways it is the very same people who benefit from economic individualism, also benefit from a society framed around the liberation of people from the tyranny of custom, those who embrace experiments in living, and the dismantling of the older institutions that once conveyed custom and tradition, those little platoons praised by Edmund Burke. See, I'd get in another British thinker, I'm sorry, he's Irish. Far from presenting an antithetical view of human liberation, economic or social, Anglo-American versus continental European, the two seem to be in practice converging. It may be, and indeed I would submit that all the while these two liberalisms have worked together, both for a kind of individuality, seemingly opposed to each other, but in fact that the kind of individuality envisioned by Mill, right, the experiments in living, requires and benefits from the fluidity of a global marketplace, while the kind of economic inequality envisioned by Locke and Madison encourages and even results in the fluid sense of self realized in a liberalized social order. What I want to suggest today, or at least warn us against, is that I think increasingly we have come to view this outcome as what is democracy. This is democracy. This is what constitutes democracy. When we defend democracy, this is what we defend. This realization. That this realization of the liberation of the individual, economically, socially, and otherwise, forms the essence of democracy, the extent to which we can all become autonomous, self-making selves who have been liberated from one another. And in some senses, our conference organizers have even echoed some of these sentiments in the opening sentence describing this gathering. Modern democracies are the epitomes of unprecedented progress, freedom, and wealth. Is that what democracy is? And yet it might be the case that these very achievements mask how these achievements have been realized by undermining the fundamental conditions for the realization and practice of democracy itself, as I would submit we should understand it. That by requiring the weakening of social and civic and relational ties and practices for the sake of progress and freedom and wealth, we have actually damaged the prospects for democracy. And as I've been suggesting, the thinkers who originated this project were all, in fact, deeply hostile to actual democracy, seeking to constrain it. The privatized and individualized selves that have formed the shared aim of the two faces of liberalism actually make for thin civic gruel. A public sphere increasingly a space used for claiming more individual liberty, where more freedom of self-making is invoked. I note, for example, and not to be a controversialist, but I've been in London and every business has a rainbow flag. Perhaps the biggest political agenda of recent years has been the effort to achieve legal and social recognition of gay marriage. But we have seen, in fact, a remarkable kind of wedding around this issue. The powers of economic liberty, every corporation in the United States and across the world backing this movement, aligning with proponents of Mill's experiments in living, relentlessly winning victories in the name of freedom. And yet, all the while, marriage, in fact, is in complete decay, decline, disarray. We're fighting for the right to marry, but there is no party for marriage. There is no party who is actually saying that what we fundamentally need is a society of connection. And the most fundamental form of connection is the connection that we form in families, building out from that into our neighborhoods, into our communities, into our broader societies. What is the party, then, of self-limitation, of bonds that limit our individuality, of bonds that might limit our thinking of ourselves merely as economic agents and engines? It turns out that the liberated individual is both very useful for capitalism as well as Mill's experiments in individuality. We should then be unsurprised that in spite of all the apparent accomplishments of modern liberalism, we are at the same time in the midst of a crisis of democracy. If democracy is defined as the increased atomization of society, then we live in the most democratic of ages. There can be no doubt. But if democracy is about the effort of citizens to achieve together a form of practiced self-government through the development of civic capacities, through the practice of deliberation that requires both listening and reasoning, as well as speaking, that requires a common deposit of shared understanding, won through long, shared, and ongoing interaction, and requires the learned capacity for compromise, and what Tocqueville described as the enlargement of the heart that occurs through shared deliberation, not before it, but as, in some ways, after, or as a consequence of. Then we live perhaps in the least democratic of ages, and have been living consistently in among the least democratic of ages. And this current crisis of democracy, and we meet here today in part because of this, is not in spite of these measurements of freedom and prosperity, but maybe in significant part because of what has been required to achieve many of those successes. The widespread and growing loss of confidence in the legitimacy of democracy, not only in name but in fact, is revealingly expressed in a growing animus both against perceived manipulations of globalized market forces, right? The corporations manipulating politics, but also distant and unaccountable bureaucrats, on the other hand. If we think that the solution to the problem of corporations is more state, we have a problem. And if we think that the solution to the problem of the state is more corporations, we have a problem. Both of these conditions have arisen together, seeking simultaneously the liberation of the individual self, who is no longer a self-governing citizen, but a free radical and a powerless monad, depoliticized, depleted of civic discipline and capacity, lacking practices of civic engagement and deliberation, reduced to expressing political discontent increasingly through mass protest, shouting, banging drums. I'm living on Trafalgar Square right now, and I know this noise only too well. They are the voices not of the powerful, but in some ways of the voiceless, a politics without a polis, and as citizens without a civic life. We're not experiencing a decline or even crisis of democracy, in part because I would submit we do not live in a properly understood democracy. And to the extent to which we use the language and legitimation of democracy as a mantle over our political preferences, I think shrouds the extent to which our political order is essentially driven by a different political ideal. Now, while I understand that much of the conversation today in the organization, H21, and I laud this, is concerned with arriving at the right kinds of voting mechanisms, of how citizens can express themselves in more sophisticated ways, I would suggest that voting is itself the end of a long sentence. It's the period at the end of a sentence. And we ought to concern ourselves at least as much with what occurs before that sentence, before the period. What is the nature and form of the political deliberation and the soil, the compost in which democratic deliberation can take place today? And here, having perhaps been a little bit snide about the opening sentence of the program, let me offer a word of praise of the quote by your first president, Thomas Masaryk. I hope I'm not killing that name, Masaryk. I once said that democracy is a discussion. However, true discussion is only possible where people trust each other and genuinely seek the truth. Democracy is a conversation between equals, a united contemplation of free citizens before the whole public. Fostering such a citizenry requires us to re-examine some of the deepest fundamental commitments of our age, a discomfiting exercise in any age. But for those who count ourselves as Democrats, our common life suggests that we can do no less and demands that we do much more. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, now we have time for a couple of questions. If you want to have a question, please raise your hand, and then afterwards push the button, the green button in front of you, next to the microphone.
Adam, could I ask one of your colleagues for a glass of water? Thank you.
Have any questions? Yes, the gentleman over there.
Okay. So, thank you very much for a very inspiring and deep talk. That means humanly deep talk, because I'm coming from mathematics education community, and I think that you mentioned Enlightenment and Rousseau and all this stuff, and there is this political part of Rousseau, but there is also education. And I think education is one of the fundamental cores of democracy, and somehow the degradation of democratic values, which you very nicely showed and explained, is, I think, also connected with the degradation of educational culture. So we are really driven by results, by tests, by performance, and not by understanding, not by really discussing, not by the social context, because I think that the child firstly socializes in his family and then at school. And these are the two most important experiences where it can learn democracy.
Yeah, I agree completely. Thank you for that. One of the things that I write about in my book and have been long thinking about and discussing is the transformation of the educational system. And I'm especially concerned with universities, but of course universities are only, the end of a long process. And in particular, we could say not only the degradation of citizenship, but the degradation of liberal arts and the liberal arts tradition. And I want to emphasize what that means. The liberal arts, thank you so much, the liberal arts, right, were premised upon an idea that you have to learn to be free. I think about the very meaning of the words liberal arts, that you're not born free, that freedom is something that one learns, and that one learns that especially through an encounter with some of the greatest thinkers who in part explore what is freedom and what are its limits. Right? My first book and dissertation was written on the Odyssey. Is Odysseus most free when he's offered immortality on the island of Calypso, or when he accepts mortality and limitation to become merely the king of Ithaca and husband to Penelope and father of Telemachus? Right? This is something that someone engaged in the liberal arts would have to confront, this investigation and question, what is it to be human? What is it to be free? What is it to be a member of a human community? What's striking, and certainly I think is probably true in Europe, certainly true in the United States, is the complete decline of this tradition in higher education and perhaps across education, and its replacement with practical learning, the STEM disciplines. Now, I have nothing against the STEM disciplines, but if that's all that constitutes education, it means that what we have assumed is that we know what freedom is. And freedom is the capacity to manipulate the things of the world through technology, among other things, through the application of technology, to ensure our freedom from other things, from nature and from other people. It was mentioned the climate crisis, right? Why does a climate crisis occur? It occurs in part because we understand freedom to be the conquest of nature, the human conquest of nature. If that's what constitutes freedom, then in some sense you could say our education system is serving that end very well. But if freedom is in some ways the capacity to learn the art of being free, and here I think Rousseau is central in making these arguments, among others, then I think we are seeing, of course, a crisis of politics, a crisis in social life, but of course deeply, as would have to be, a crisis of education. I agree completely with that suggestion. Thank you.
And we have time for one more question.
Patrick, thank you very much for taking us through the history of democracy and kind of holding us back to the traditional writers. It's great for me to hear again about the Federalist Papers.
I'm having a little hard time hearing it.
My question is about, you mentioned the divide between the populists and the bureaucrats, and you talking about the good bureaucrats in a way. Here in this country, we might be experiencing something else, and in my view, it's worse. It's actually collusion of the bureaucrats with the populists. So my question is, what might be the practical checks and balances we need to introduce in order to meet two goals, which I think are essential? One is how we develop and kind of educate and put in place a class of the bureaucrats which will understand what the common interests are, what the public interests are. Second, how we actually keep them in the bay. So how we ensure that they do not exploit the powers they will gain, actually.
Yeah, in some ways, I think what you're describing is the problem of capture of bureaucrats, right? And this is a long-standing problem. James Q. Wilson, American political scientist, studied this in a great book he wrote called Of Bureaucracy. And he argued that the more likely capture is the capture by industry. And I would say that this has been, at least certainly in the American experience, one of the dominant problems of the rise of the bureaucracy, which is that it forms a kind of what Wilson called an iron triangle between the industries in some ways being regulated or impacted, the elected representatives who have expertise or at least power in those areas, and the bureaucrats who become sort of permanent members of those areas. Interestingly, Wilson suggested and argued that there was a greater need for a kind of the capacity for a democratic oversight over that iron triangle. Now, what of course I think you're suggesting is that what the political class now is increasingly perhaps representing this populist class, and maybe no better solution than what preceded it. Because an elected class is always in some ways going to potentially collude with these other parts of the iron triangle. It's no solution. And it's certainly, I think, going to remain a problem as long as we have a bureaucracy. My own view tends to be, and it perhaps is not a very satisfying one in the modern world, is to attempt to move as much of a bureaucracy to more local levels of governance, right? To move them away always from the center, where they tend to inhabit and grow and increase out of a kind of self-interest, always seeking to increase their budget, using their power to manipulate the federal government, federal agencies, to increase their presence. It's a kind of self-interest, in order to increase their power over the entire policy in that area. And this is done in part in the name of a homogenization of policy across an entire nation, or in the case of Europe, across all of the European continent. But of course, it exacerbates the effect of this capture and of being disassociated and disconnected from the populace. So there at least needs to be as much emphasis against pushing back from this logic of bureaucracy, of a kind of centralization and becoming more distant. and putting where, in a sense, bureaucracy can function at a more local level. In other words, in part, where more prudence can be exercised. Right? And I would say this is an important part of bureaucracy. And we all know this. When you go to a bureaucrat, you know, I needed an extension on my driver's license, or I was late with my tax bill, or what you will. You hope you have a bureaucrat who's not merely looking at the sheet of paper and saying, this is what you have to do. You want a bureaucrat who can exercise some discretion, can exercise prudence. And where is one most likely to find that kind of discretion and prudence? With someone who kind of, in some ways, knows you, or at least is familiar with someone like you, is perhaps more a part of your community. So that one of the problems of bureaucracy doesn't become merely to be completely distant from the people. I think this aspect of modern politics, its inevitable centralization, is one of the features of the liberalism I described. While it seems to claim a defense of limited government, what it ends up in many ways is sponsoring and promoting an expansion both of the state and of the market, to the point where most ordinary citizens feel like they no longer control or have a connection to either. So one of the things it seems to me Democrats need to be concerned with is how do we bring this thing of government and the state and even the economy closer to the level of citizens, where they feel they actually exercise some control, and voting, whether it's 1 vote or 4 votes or 8 votes, isn't just an exercise in sort of symbolic keeping of the guard. And I would urge us to think structurally as well about the challenge of democracy in a centralizing and enlarging age. So thank you very much. I appreciate again this invitation.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Deneen, for that insightful talk.